first encountered Merleau Ponty's work, and specifically his Phenomenology of Perception, in a graduate seminar on phenomenology led by John Russon at Penn State. And it was, I would say, a life and philosophically changing moment for me. It actually reminds me of this scene in Anne Carson's novel Autobiography of Red, where she talks about a moment when two characters meet and it's the opposite of blindness. She says, the world poured back and forth between their eyes a few times. And that's roughly, in a somewhat poetic way, a good description of what it felt like to me to first read Merleau Ponty's work.
So I don't remember when I first actually started reading Merleau Ponty, but I remember the moment when it was suggested to me that I should start reading. And that was when I was taking a course as an undergraduate student at the University of Toronto in Hegel's Phenomenology. John Russon was the teacher of that course. And I remember standing around outside with a bunch of other students and with John, and we were talking about some of the themes raised in the opening pages of the Phenomenology. Merleau Ponty's name came up, and I said to John, I know this guy's important, I've heard his name before, and so where should I start? And he suggested starting with the Phenomenology of Perception. So that, of course, is like one of those contingent moments in one's life that could easily have been forgotten, but for what it subsequently led to in my life, which was an engagement over many years with Merleau Ponty's philosophy. And it exemplifies in a certain way a theme that runs through Merleau Ponty's work, this idea of institution, of Fundierung, of a founding, how that is established kind of retroactively, that we're not caused to go certain directions in our life. Things that operate as motive forces in our life come to light often retroactively in virtue of the kind of creative engagement that we enact with it over the course of our life, over the course of the choices we make, or the forms of expression that we have.
I first encountered Merleau Ponty as an undergraduate student, and I think that the reasons that I felt drawn to him then really remain the reasons that I still feel drawn to him. I was a psychology major, and I'd taken psychology because I wanted to understand being human better, and I was not terribly satisfied. But I'd heard about a young philosophy professor who was supposed to be a very good teacher, and I'd taken one philosophy course in logic, and so I thought maybe I'd give this one a try. It was a course on Merleau Ponty's Phenomenology of Perception. It was way over my head, but I still learned tons and was, reeled in to studying Merleau Ponty. That young professor was John Russon, and there were a number of people in that class who went on to become philosophy professors and to publish on Merleau Ponty. So David Morris was a graduate student sitting in on the class, and David Chavada and Maria Tolero were both undergraduates in that class. And it was a very meaningful class. It was the place where I first had the experience, we are talking about being human now. This is getting at what I've been searching for.
For many years, Toronto has been the site of a vibrant community of phenomenologists, largely brought together by John Russon in his annual summer seminar in philosophy. I interviewed John Russon, Kirsten Jacobson, Kim McLaren, and Scott Morato about Merleau Ponty and the Toronto seminar. John, you've published a lot of original work in phenomenology, beginning with your book Human Experience, and more recently with your book Adult Life. The influence of Merleau Ponty is evident throughout your work, for example, in your stress on embodiment or in your interpretation of childhood experience. Can you tell us what, in your view, is the most important contribution that Merleau Ponty's Phenomenology of Perception makes to phenomenology?
Merleau Ponty's Phenomenology of Perception makes, incredible contributions at so many levels. Many people can take it up essentially as an empirical work that advances study in psychology, medicine, linguistics, art history, and in all those ways, it really has something to offer. But to me, what's most distinctive and important about the Phenomenology of Perception is its work, is its role as a work of philosophy. And what that means to me is, I think of philosophy as the engagement with questions of first principles, and so that's what I think about when I think about the Phenomenology of Perception. How is it engaging with those fundamental questions of the first principles of knowledge and reality that the whole tradition of philosophy is engaged with? And that is what you see in the Phenomenology of Perception in Merleau Ponty's engagement with the very meaning of what phenomenology is. What is phenomenology? Well, it's fundamentally a method. We typically think of it as the description of lived experience, or the description of the form in which experience is lived. It's an interesting and somewhat paradoxical method right off the bat, because it's a method that's already a conclusion, right? Because it's precisely from our attention to the form our experience takes that we come to the conclusion that being rigorous about that demands that we adopt a phenomenological method. So how do we account for that first thing that gets us the method? Is that the use of the method? Is it something else? It's a tricky question. But anyway, I mentioned that first just to show how it's not, even at the very level of the question of method, it's not an easy notion, and there's philosophical complexity built into it, much of which Merleau Ponty explores and investigates. But let's talk more about the method itself. Phenomenology is the description of experience. Well, it's a phenomenon is the experience. Logy is the description. The word is just made up of those two other pieces. And it seems to me that Merleau Ponty's work makes a pretty significant contribution on each of those two sides. On the side of the phenomenon, when we say we're going to describe the form our experience takes, we often think of the phenomenon as, what we would find if we were to introspect. So phenomenology can seem like just looking at what I take my own experience to be. In fact, even at that level, that's a pretty valuable thought. And the idea that the sort of first-person perspective has to be taken seriously is hugely important in all kinds of areas where it's not taken seriously, especially things like mental health and so on. But I think that what Merleau Ponty offers is actually a stronger version of that. And it's the idea that to find out what the form is that our experience takes is itself a matter for science. And so, one of the things that's most striking about the book is his drawing on the history of psychology and physiology and so on to find out what the form is in which we live our experience. And so the idea there is that discerning the phenomenon is itself a scientific matter. And that's been very interesting and important because it has brought the empirical sciences into phenomenology. Maybe even more important, though, because it's taken phenomenology into the empirical sciences and really emphasized this point that you can't really satisfactorily carry out studies of our experience from any side, from the side of psychology, from the side of physiology, whatever, without satisfactorily accounting or taking account of the role of subjectivity. But he also makes an important contribution at the side of the logos, or the side of the description, and that's the thing that I just want to emphasize as what in the long run I think is his most powerful contribution. And so we think of the description of the form experience takes. Description we often think of as a kind of mechanical copying of an already finished text, an already finished original. But what Merleau Ponty shows really effectively in his discussion of expression in the phenomenology of perception is that description is not such a simple copying, but description is always already a sort of exploration and discovery of uncharted territory, and that the descriptive process is therefore also a creative process and inherently transformative of the, in this case, in the phenomenological context, of the experience under description. And so I think the last and most important point I would make is that Merleau Ponty really shows that the phenomenological method can't really be separated from existential change. We can't really engage in the experience, in the practice of describing our experience without fundamentally transforming our relationship to it. That's what I think then is ultimately his greatest contribution.
One of the most distinctive aspects of Merleau Ponty's phenomenology that John identified is the overcoming of the dualism between physiology and psychology. Merleau-Ponty's stress on the embodied character of our experience and on the bodily basis of meaning in general has been deeply significant for my own work. In particular, it has helped me to see how our habits, perception, and agency as individuals is always shaped by our belonging to social groups, such as gender, race, and class, and how social and political transformation always takes the form of the development of new habits and of new possibilities for perception and expression. I asked Kim McLaren, Kirsten Jacobson, and Scott Morato about the significance for their own work of the description of lived experience and the scientific study of the natural body. As John noted, Merleau Ponty was very astute psychologically, and he was also very well informed scientifically. Kim, can you talk about the significance of this theme and its importance for your own involvement with philosophy?
Merleau Ponty is able so beautifully to both describe and show the importance of layers of experience, unreflective experience, that are typically obscured by our theories and the stories that we tell about ourselves. The thing is that I see this in my students too, as well as myself. It was difficult to put together this very compelling account of experience with the science that's rather mechanistic science that I had been indoctrinated into, the physiology and the brain science. And so I ended up feeling conflicted and split. How do these two things fit together? And the beautiful thing about Merleau Ponty is he takes on that project. He addresses physiology and sciences of the body and shows us through a penetrating critique and a rethinking of physiology how we must understand the body such that it fits with our account of experience, our unreflective experience. And so I just had the experience as a student of finally getting a fully integrated vision of being human rather than feeling competing accounts at work in myself.
Kirsten, your research is focused largely on issues of health. How has Merleau Ponty's challenge to the dualism between psychology and physiology been relevant here?
I think if we follow Merleau Ponty's arguments in the phenomenology of perception, we are necessarily pushed to think about health in a more expansive way than we typically do, both in everyday societal terms, but also in terms of our dominant modes of healthcare. And what I mean by that is if we think about how illness shows up for us, it's never something that just deals with a body that can be treated by certain medicines or certain therapies in an isolated way. We're always dealing with a person who's at the root of a system of meanings, and those meanings are either supported or hindered by our various experiences of being healthy or being ill. And unfortunately, I think often that's not well enough addressed in contemporary medical practices. In my own research, what I've done is to try to look anew or to read again various experiences of illness, ranging from anorexia and agoraphobia to spatial neglect or issues pertaining to dying that that need to be re-examined. And Merleau Ponty's philosophy gives us the tools for doing so. He allows us ways of noticing how a particular embodied experience shows up or expands out into a larger experience of being in the world. And in some cases, that means there are going to be various pressure points that could be affected or adjusted to end up allowing a person to be in a greater or lesser experience of health.
Scott, for you too, this rejection of the dualism of mind and body has been of central significance for your research. Can you say more specifically what issue in Merleau Ponty's philosophy has most shaped your thinking?
I mean, if I could just pinpoint a concept, it would be the concept of intercorporeity. That the idea in Merleau Ponty that we in our immediate encounter with the world as sentient bodies, the way we're, as he puts it, that we're geared into it, we are at the same time, as he puts it, haunted by others. And to me, the way that notion of the responsivity of our body to the behaviors, to the significance imminent to the behavior of others, also shapes the way we're open to the world and the way we encounter it, helps me to grasp how, as perceivers, as experiencers, we are involved with others from the beginning, that at issue in our perception is ethical life, political life, historical life, the life of language and culture. In our bodily lives, we are not caused by things external to us. There's a way in which our bodies are responding to the facticity of our situation as motive forces, and therefore exercise is a kind of creative engagement with our context, with our situation, with our inheritance. To me, that's a crucial issue for understanding the nature of freedom and agency in political life.
Kim, your research is focused on the place of other people in our experience. Can you tell us what is unique and important about Merleau Ponty's phenomenology of our experience of other people?
Other philosophers have taught us very well about the otherness of others and the need to respect difference. But Merleau Ponty, while holding on to that otherness and that difference, also shows us that it always comes hand in hand with a coexistence with others. And that coexistence is in part a matter of sharing a social and cultural world with them, being with them. But it's also often a matter of being drawn by others into a new world, into a world that's beyond our own. This matter of drawing others into a new world only happens by virtue of our perspective sort of transgressing into theirs, encroaching or transgressing into their perspective. And so I think on Merleau Ponty's account, we are inevitably this transgression. He says, to love someone, to spend time with someone is always to decide on their behalf. And so our ethics can't just be a kind of Kantian respect for others as ends in themselves, because we have to recognize that we are always engaged in a kind of inevitable violation of infiltrating other people's ways of perceiving and experiencing. And so our ethics requires a sort of taking responsibility for this infiltration, for this violation in a way. And therefore, it requires of us also that we're constantly in the process of learning what it would take to be with this other in a way that promotes their freedom, supports their freedom.
We often imagine that thinking is an activity we carry out privately, in the silence of our own solitary minds. Merleau Ponty's phenomenology, on the contrary, reveals that thinking is always a matter of intersubjectivity and always a matter of language. John talked about the relevance of this idea for his summer seminar. John, you've been running an annual seminar in philosophy for nearly 20 years. This seminar has played a significant role in shaping a community of phenomenologists and has led, among other things, to the publication of the volume Perception and Its Developments in Merleau Ponty's Phenomenology, which is essentially a collaboration of a number of the participants in the seminar. Can you tell us a bit about this seminar?
Yeah, there's an essay I really like by the phenomenological psychologist Ava Sims, where she analyzes the way a group of small children over an extended period of time and through a range of activities effectively carry out a collective act of thinking, collective act of problem solving. And I think that analysis of thinking as something that's not something done by a private individual in his or her their isolated mind, but that is rather a collective activity carried out through practical interactions, guided essentially by discourse and expression. I think that's a very powerful idea and a very powerful interpretation of the nature of thought, a very powerful description of the nature of thought. And that idea has pretty much guided my teaching. The very first course I taught as a full-time professor was at the University of Toronto. It was a course on Merleau Ponty's Phenomenology of Perception, and it was a class of probably about 25 people, but it was a great class. I think at least 6 people in that class went on to be philosophy professors, which is pretty amazing. And the class worked so well, I think, for 3 reasons. One was because I was very enthusiastic. Second was because those students were, really smart and really enthusiastic, really committed. And the third was because we were reading this great book, Merleau Ponty's Phenomenology. And it seems to be those 3 things coming together allowed that thing we did, Monday, Wednesday, and Friday morning at 8:30, I think it was, allowed that to be over the course of 3 months, this very powerful collective active thinking where I think many, many people in that group felt themselves to be participating in, a powerful elevation of our minds as we went somewhere together. And that has continued to guide me in my teaching since that first class. Not every class works that well. But I also had the privilege of teaching at Penn State University for quite a few years with great colleagues like Joe Cockelmans and John Salas, Al Lingus, really strong phenomenologists. And the students were amazing. And the graduate seminars there similarly struck me as being these collective acts of thinking, where a group of people were working together and talking about an inspiring text, and it moved us all to places we could never get on our own. And that's what's guided me in building this Toronto seminar, which I've been running since 2003. Every summer I get about 20 or 25 people, faculty members and graduate students, to come together, and we read a great book of philosophy. I also believe that great philosophy is phenomenology. It always is phenomenology. And so the seminar is really premised on the idea that we are going to hold ourselves responsible to reading these works as analyses and descriptions of the forms of lived experience. And I think the participants in that seminar, like me, would attest to the fact that it's consistently the case that we can bring 20, 25 people together. We work hard at reading and talking together, and we all experience ourselves as effectively being elevated to a thought, a deeper grasp of the nature of meaning as it's functioning in our own experience, that comes from the inspiration of these texts, and also our collective effort through discourse, and also through interacting together in other ways, through effectively living together for a week, to socializing together, to pull ourselves more deeply into these insights into the nature of our experience. And for me, that's been really a life-changing experience, and I can't imagine not having done it, and I'll continue it for as long as I possibly can.
I first met John in 2009 when I began my graduate studies at the University of Guelph, and he invited me to participate in his summer seminar. It was a very significant experience for me. I asked others to talk about their experience of the Toronto seminar. When I first participated in John's summer seminar, I was struck by the power of collective conversation for developing important philosophical insights through studies of great works in the history of philosophy. That summer, the seminar was on Augustine's Confessions. I was able to take phenomenologically rich lessons from that work that I couldn't possibly have taken simply by reading it on my own or simply by listening to an expert lecture on the text. Since then, I've had similar experiences nearly every summer through collective study of works such as Plato's Republic, Kant's Metaphysics of Morals, Hegel's Aesthetics, and Sartre's Critique of Dialectical Reason. Can you say something about how the seminar has been significant for you?
The Toronto seminar brings together about 20 people each summer to read a book together over the course of a week, meeting 4 hours a day. And the format that it takes is typically that one person will introduce the reading, and then we will all discuss it together. The Toronto seminar has been a very anchoring and grounding experience for me, because each year it really brings me back to what it is to think with others. And I think that thinking with is really where philosophy happens. To be immersed for a week with other people who are educated in and practiced at opening themselves up to a text and dwelling with the issues in the text is a very enriching experience. And it's, as I said, it's grounding for me. I feel like it brings me back to what philosophy is really about.
One of the most shaping parts for me of my graduate experience in philosophy was the rich and challenging experiences that occurred during seminar discussions. It was a time when not only were you interacting and working with the guiding insights of your professor, but you were getting a chance to dig into that material and be responsible to it yourself with a community of others. And that's something that's really sadly lost for the most part when we enter into professional academic life. And John's summer seminar does exactly that for us who are already in the profession or who are close to entering the profession. And it is just an absolutely exciting, challenging, often thought-shifting experience to spend, almost 2 weeks talking with other highly motivated, highly insightful persons at roughly your same level of intellectual aptitude and professional life.
So when I think about the Toronto seminar, I'm reminded, that there's a kind of caricature about phenomenology that it's a sort of introspective philosophy. It's a philosophy of like first personal reflection, kind of psychological self-examination or something like that. And yet, a key insight, as I was just talking about in connection with Merleau Ponty, a key insight of phenomenology is that our thinking, that we care about ideas, that we care about language and culture and shared meanings, because from the beginning, our minds are an intersubjective reality, that they're involved in the terrain of shared concerns, of intersubjectivity. And so thinking isn't a private activity we carry on in the interiority of our own heads. It's a kind of dialogical or a kind of conversational reality. And to engage with that seriously means to undertake thinking and reading in a way that is mindfully responsive to the thinking of others. And so the Toronto seminar, at John's invitation, a group of scholars, some of them people who've been there from the beginning, some new faces, been meeting each summer, working through different books, Hegel, Derrida, Heidegger, Merleau Ponty, Plato, Aristotle, attending carefully to these texts, but doing so in a way that is at the same time attending carefully to others' reception of the text and others' attempts to work it out through their own examples, through thinking about it in connection with examples from child psychology or from one's experiences of one's own family or dwelling in certain places, or the kinds of things that for each of us helps to make the right connections to bring the inner meaning of a text to light. That we do that together, that we are comfortable with the silences that arise inevitably in the course of such a conversation, that we leave aside our own obsessions in our reading in order to attend to where somebody else is taking it and pick up where they've left off or something like that. That kind of practice of cultivating one's own readerly attention or something in a kind of community with other people I like to think that it's shaped me as a teacher, as a thinker, as a person, and 2 decades of doing that, it's a pretty rich thing. I mean, we have those kinds of experiences in classrooms at various moments, but to cultivate that so deliberately each summer for a number of days in these libraries and community centers in Toronto where we would meet for hours, working through so carefully a text. I just can't imagine at this point, it just seems like an institution in my life. So that seems to be a theme that I keep coming back to.